On a quiet strip of Ukrainian forest, a Russian armored column rolled forward in a tight spearhead toward the trenches. Two tanks packed with ammunition, an APC and an MTLB pushed ahead, while gunners in the rear hammered the line with shells. Thick smoke poured across the tree line, trying to blind Ukrainian scouts and drown the view of any waiting drones in the sky. To anyone watching from a distance, it looked like a textbook assault, with steel, fire, and noise moving in one hard wave. But hidden teams with Javelin launchers were already in position, and FPV operators were tracking every meter of that advance in real time. What was about to happen was not a simple tank clash, because this short fight would turn into a race between armor and algorithms. This battle raises a hard question for every modern army, as cheap flying bombs and smart missiles now meet heavy metal on narrow roads. Stay with Military Force, hit like and subscribe, because this report breaks down what really happened in that forest and what it means for the future of armored warfare. The Russian assault began with a classic armored formula. As a compact column of tanks, an APC and an MTLB rolled toward the Ukrainian line along a narrow approach beside the forest and the trenches. The vehicles moved in a staggered spearhead, with the lead tank taking point and the others offset behind it, so the column could push through soft ground while still keeping overlapping fields of fire. Artillery crews behind them fired steady barrages ahead of the route, trying to pin Ukrainian defenders in their trenches and shake their nerves before the armored punch arrived. At the same time, crews on the tanks lobbed shells toward likely strong points and junctions, so any anti-tank team that showed a profile on the skyline would be forced to duck or relocate. Thick smoke rounds burst along the tree line and over suspected firing positions, building a moving curtain that was meant to blind optics on the ground and cut the view for any loitering drones. Inside that haze, the APC carried assault troops who were expected to dismount close to the line, rush into the tree belt, and turn the trenches from a clear front into a confused melee. The MTLB followed as a workhorse with extra ammunition and supplies, because Russian planners assumed the push would turn into a rolling fight that needed quick resupply at the edge of contact. From a doctrinal view, this was a textbook Soviet-style combined arms push, where armor, artillery, and infantry move as one wave and try to break the defense through shock, noise, and constant pressure. Commanders trusted that heavy armor with side skirts and improvised cages could survive the first missiles, while smoke and barrage fire would slow any Ukrainian kill chain based on Javelin teams and FPV operators. The narrow corridor between the forest and the trenches looked risky, yet it also offered cover from long-range fire. So the column gambled that speed and mass would be enough to cross that short killing zone. To keep that tempo, gunners focused on suppressive fire rather than precise shots, because the main goal was to deny the enemy a clean sight picture instead of chasing single perfect hits. Radio traffic in the column stayed busy but controlled, with orders stressing movement and spacing, since any halt on the approach road would turn every vehicle into an easy mark for overhead observers. The logic behind this plan came from decades of training that taught Russian crews to trust armor, artillery, and smoke whenever they faced dug-in infantry with modern anti-tank weapons. What that doctrine did not fully account for was a defender who could see through the noise, link scouts and missiles in seconds, and turn each pause in the advance into a signal to fire. As the lead tank pushed deeper into the haze and the rest of the column followed its tracks, that gap between old assumptions and new threats began to open wider with every meter. The moment the vehicles crossed the last fold of ground before the trenches, Ukrainian missile crews saw the pattern they were waiting for and prepared to turn the armored thrust into a stalled and burning line. The first Javelin shot decided the rhythm of the fight, because when it slammed into the lead tank, the whole armored line lost speed and lost confidence at the same time. The missile hit from above, where the armor is thinner, and the blast tore through the turret ring so fast that the rest of the column saw only fire and fragments instead of a moving spearhead. Drivers behind the burning wreck were forced to stop or swerve on a narrow lane beside the forest. And that short pause turned a mobile attack into a row of targets stuck in one killing field. In that same window, another anti-tank team fired a second guided missile at the MTLB in the rear. And when that vehicle was hit, the line lost both protection at the front and support at the back. What had been planned as a hard push now looked like a broken train of steel on bad ground. And that is exactly the kind of picture that invites the rest of the Ukrainian kill chain to move. Once the vehicles stalled, Ukrainian commanders gave clearance for drones and guns to work. So the defense shifted from a few hidden launchers to a full network of sensors and firepower. FPV operators who had been tracking the approach in silence now received exact coordinates and headings, which meant every frame from their cameras could be turned into a firing solution in seconds. Spotters shared positions of each hull over secure links, and artillery batteries adjusted their aim to match what the drone feeds showed. So shells and loitering munitions could strike the same space in tight succession. This kind of coordination matters because it lets cheap platforms and classic guns act like one system, and that system can punish any armored unit that loses motion on a narrow road. The first drones went for the ammunition carriers and the armored troop vehicle, since those machines carried both explosive cargo and the soldiers needed to hold any ground that might be taken. One munition dropped straight onto an APC roof, where armor is relatively thin, and the blast punched inside the compartment and set off rounds stored near the fighting space. The vehicle turned into a fireball, and when ammunition inside began to cook off, the secondary bursts scattered hot fragments across the lane and forced nearby crews to duck low inside their hulls. Every second they stayed buttoned up made it harder for them to see the battlefield, and that loss of awareness gave more room for guided weapons and drones to pick fresh angles and fresh weak spots. Another strike hit a vehicle loaded with fuel, and that impact sent both flames and thick smoke into the air, creating a chaotic screen that did not care which side it blinded. Russian crews now had to choose between staying inside machines that might be hit again or bailing out into open ground under the eyes of drones. And either option cut the strength of the original assault. Cluster munitions joined the pattern, breaking up any attempt to regroup around surviving hulls. So instead of forming a new line, small groups of soldiers were left scattered and pinned under falling bomblets. By this point, the armored thrust no longer had shape, because vehicles were burning, some were stuck, and others were backing away on a route already marked in the memory of every FPV operator watching. The important detail is that no single weapon ended this first attack on its own, since it was the sequence of Javelin hits, follow-on missiles, drones, and artillery that turned one push into a field of wrecks. This layered response shows how Ukraine now uses missiles and unmanned systems together, and it also sets the stage for how heavier assets like Leopard 2 tanks would enter the same battle under a very different kind of sky. Leopard 2 entered the fight as a heavy answer to the pressure on the line, and its first shots changed the mood on both sides. The German-built tank moved up to a firing position near the tree line, and its crew began engaging Russian armor that was still trying to regroup after the earlier missile strikes. Russian infantry fighting vehicles that had tried to edge forward suddenly found themselves bracketed by accurate fire, and several were hit hard enough to stop in place or retreat in reverse down the narrow approach. From the Russian point of view, helmet cameras showed soldiers under fire from several angles at once, as bursts from the main gun and coaxial weapons broke up formations that were still searching for safe ground. Leopard 2 did not stay fixed behind one berm, because the crew used short bounds along the rim of the forest, firing from different spots to avoid becoming a predictable mark for artillery observers or FPV operators. This pattern of movement and fire mattered, since the constant disruption made it much harder for assault groups to turn a temporary foothold into a stable base for new pushes or ambush teams. With each high-explosive round that landed near a suspected foxhole or machine gun nest, the message to Russian troops was simple, because any pause in their crawl forward could now bring a heavy hit without warning. For a short period, Leopard 2 acted as both shield and hammer, giving Ukrainian infantry more breathing space while also punishing any attempt to collect vehicles and soldiers into a coherent spearhead. However, that same aggressive profile came with a cost, as operating close to the front under constant observation made the tank a prime target for Russian operators hunting for high-value kills. When the crew eventually began to pull back from the hottest sector to reposition and reduce exposure, a Russian kamikaze drone seized the opportunity and dove in from above. The unmanned aircraft struck the tank with a direct impact that appears to have damaged critical systems, because the vehicle then veered off course and slid helplessly into a trench. The loss had a double effect, as Russian media could present footage of a Western tank knocked out by a cheap flying bomb, while Ukrainian planners were reminded that even modern armor cannot operate near the line without a tight air defense and counter-drone bubble. This episode underlines a wider truth about today's battlefield, since it shows that protection is no longer just a question of steel thickness, but also of electronic cover, early warning, and the ability to clear the air around key platforms. The way Leopard 2 first dominated and then fell also illustrates how quickly momentum can swing when one side brings a single heavy asset into a space where the enemy has adapted its tactics and technology. For analysts and officers watching this fight, the scene reinforces the idea that Western tanks are powerful tools when used inside a dense combined arms framework. Yet they become vulnerable when that framework is thin or delayed. This balance between striking power and exposure is pushing every army to rethink how often and how far forward they risk their best machines in terrain that is crowded with sensors and small explosive carriers. In this case, the brief reign of Leopard 2 at the forest edge and its sudden removal from the field opened a new tactical question for both commands about how to follow up under shifting conditions. Russian officers had to decide whether to press the gap left by the disabled tank with yet more vehicles and troops, while Ukrainian leaders needed to find fresh ways to hold the corridor without that armored anchor. Those parallel calculations set the scene for the larger reinforced assault that would soon roll into the same forest belt with a different mix of vehicles and a new set of risks on both sides. The reinforced Russian push began when a larger armored group with several BMPs and a special mine-clearing vehicle moved toward the same forest belt. This engineering vehicle, sometimes called a mine-clearing Leopard in reports, was actually a heavy combat engineer machine wrapped in extra armor and metal cages. Its task was simple but dangerous, because it had to drive at the front of the column, trigger any mines, and keep the route open for the infantry fighting vehicles behind it. With the path forced in this way, the rest of the formation began to flow toward the tree line, where the real struggle for ground would take shape. When the BMPs reached their drop-off points close to the trees, they halted long enough for Russian infantry to jump down and spread out toward the darker cover. Soldiers moved in short rushes from stump to stump, trying to use every fold in the ground to mask themselves from Ukrainian eyes and from hovering drones. Officers urged them forward with quick orders on the radio, since any delay near the vehicles would leave them exposed to indirect fire already sighted in on the approach lane. Ukrainian infantry advanced from their side in small teams, keeping a tight formation but using bends in the path to avoid walking straight into pre-planned kill zones. Platoon leaders focused on momentum and spacing, telling squads to clear each corner quickly so that no group would freeze under sudden contact and block the units behind them. As they stepped off from their armored carriers, they knew that staying in the open too long would invite fire from BMP guns and mortars, so the push through the woods had to be fast but controlled. This meant FPV strikes had to be timed and placed with narrow windows, often against vehicles trying to support the assault, rather than against scattered infantry pressed into the soil. The forest terrain made radar and long-range sensors less reliable, since trunks, branches, and uneven ground distorted returns and hid small targets from standard arrays. Because of that, commanders on both sides leaned more on direct human observation and simple drone optics than on deep electronic pictures of the battlefield. The Russian plan used armor, engineers, and infantry in one wave. Yet every meter gained inside the trees came at the cost of time and growing exposure to indirect fire. On the Ukrainian side, anti-tank teams, UAV crews, and gunners tried to knit their actions into one flexible defensive chain that could answer any new thrust from armor or foot soldiers. What emerged in this phase was a rough form of combined arms on both sides, with Moscow relying on BMPs and the mine-clearing vehicle to feed troops into the woods, while Kiev used missiles, drones, and guns to shape and choke that flow. That hard balance inside the forest belt would set the conditions for how much pressure the next Russian asset, the so-called mutant tank, could bring when it finally moved into the same deadly corridor. The arrival of the so-called mutant tank showed how far Russia is now willing to go to keep heavy armor alive under a constant drone threat. This vehicle looked more like a moving bunker than a classic tank, because its hull and turret were wrapped in extra plates, metal cages, and side screens designed to break the path of incoming FPV drones. FPV teams still went after it, and the first drones steered toward the flanks, looking for gaps in the side armor or in the joints where extra plates met the original hull. Several impacts hit along the side and under the cage, sending sparks and fragments across the tracks. But the vehicle kept grinding forward and refused to stop in the kill zone. Later strikes tried to slip under the protective canopy over the turret, diving at sharp angles to reach vision blocks, hatches, or the ring where the turret meets the body. Camera footage from those drones showed just how narrow the true openings were, because each approach demanded perfect timing and control in rough air and under electronic interference. Despite repeated attempts, the mutant tank survived long enough to leave a clear mark on the battle, and it took punishment that would likely have disabled a regular hull much earlier. Ukrainian sources later reported that close to 60 drones were used in the effort to neutralize that single armored vehicle, and that figure says a lot about the new economics of this war. On paper, a few $1,000s for each FPV still looks cheap compared to the price of a modern tank. Yet burning through dozens of units against one target stresses production lines and logistics. Each custom-built drone needs a frame, an engine, a warhead, electronics, and a trained operator, so the real cost includes factory time, supply chains, and hours spent in training rooms and simulators. If defenders must spend swarms of drones on every heavily protected hull, then the side that can mass-produce both platforms and munitions will gain an edge over time, even when individual trades look favorable. The outcome shows that a well-run network of ATGM teams, UAV operators, and artillery crews can still lock down a mechanized assault, even when the attacker upgrades armor and experiments with radical designs. At the same time, the heavy drone bill for one hardened target reminds Kiev that efficiency now matters as much as bravery, because each wave must balance tactical success with long-term industrial strength. This duel between tougher armor and smarter drones is turning into a race of adaptation, where Russia keeps thickening its shells and Ukraine keeps tightening its kill chain to do more damage with fewer shots. Taken together, the story of the mutant tank and the broken convoy offers a clear picture of modern mechanized warfare, where cost, technology, and learning speed are starting to weigh as much as the number of tanks on any side. This battle in a small Ukrainian forest shows that classic armored doctrine is now colliding head-on with a new age of drones and precision fire. Russian forces brought the full old playbook with tanks, MTLB, APCS, BMPs, artillery, smoke, and armored engineers. Yet that weight alone could not force a clean breakthrough. Ukrainian units answered with a tight defensive chain built from Javelin, other guided missiles, FPV swarms, tube artillery, and Leopard 2 support, and that mix turned several assaults into fields of wreckage. The appearance of a heavily modified mutant tank with thick cages and extra plating proved that Moscow is learning fast. Although such designs come with higher cost, extra weight, and slower movement. At the same time, the use of dozens of drones against a single hardened hull exposed the price Kyiv must pay in factories, workshops, and training if this style of defense continues for years. Every major army watching this fight must decide whether to put more money into extreme armor or into electronic warfare, counter-drone grids, and cheaper unmanned systems that can saturate any approach. Viewers who follow weapons and politics should keep an eye on how Russia, Ukraine, and NATO adjust their doctrine, since those choices will write the next chapter of mechanized combat. For clear maps, straight numbers, and deep frontline analysis as this story evolves, like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to Military Force so no update is missed.